What defines the genre of roguelike? Well, the way I see it, roguelike represents a challenge that involves progressing through a dungeon with procedurally generated floors in order to reach a boss or end goal of some type. Common characteristics of these games include a large fantasy setting, dwindling resources, and harsh fail states that causes greedy players to lose much in the way of progress. Roguelike is an incredibly influential genre, as a lot of games utilize its various elements. For example, the Persona games have procedurally generated dungeons. Also, many Zelda games have bonus areas that resemble roguelike dungeons, in which you have to use your resources to clear several similarly appearing floors. And a lot of resource-based games in general have harsh fail states for those who get too greedy and go into situations unprepared. I think what makes roguelike games so fun is the constant feeling of progression they often give. In many roguelike games, you will often be losing health or other resources as you move forward, but at the same time you can be leveling up your character, finding new items to make use of, gaining new powers, maybe even discovering more about the story, and etc. Compared to other games that have progression marked by the completion of a level or the defeat of a boss, roguelike games have this feeling of subtle, yet satisfying and constant progression. As long as you don't die. The roguelike I'd like to look at today is Dark Cloud. Dark Cloud was one of the first games developed for the PS2, and in fact before the PS2 came out was planned as a launch title, until it was released at much later dates, December 2000 in Japan, and November 2001 in America. Dark Cloud was also the first title developed by Level 5 Studios, who would go on to make such titles as Professor Layton, Ni no Kuni, and the more recent Yokai Watch. Now I had several reasons for wanting to look at Dark Cloud, such as how familiar the protagonist looks to another well-known face. But the main reason I wanted to look at this game is because not only is it a roguelike, but it's a roguelike that combines elements from that genre with elements of SimCity type games. As strange as that may initially sound, let's go see what that entails as we take a look at Dark Cloud for the PlayStation 2. Now let's begin. The story of Dark Cloud begins with a dark ceremony being conducted to resurrect an all-powerful evil known as the Dark Genie. Said ceremony includes a giant pot and several dancers, with a lead female dancer whom we will actually never see again. When the genie showcases himself, he is ordered by the one who orchestrated the ceremony to go out and pretty much destroy everything. We then cut to the main character, who if unnamed by the player will be called Toan. Toan is in a ceremony of his own, as he seems to be celebrating a holiday with the rest of his village. After a farewell to his mother, he goes outside to join the celebration. However, before he can do that, the Dark Genie appears and destroys his entire village. Toan wakes up and sees a man who introduces himself as the Fairy King. Fairy King informs him that he was able to use his magic powers to seal many buildings and people into small round containers called Atla so that they wouldn't be destroyed by the Dark Genie. Thinking Toan is worthy enough, he gives him a mysterious device known as the Atla Milia, which Toan can use to recover Atla and rebuild the world using the Atla he has acquired. However, the Dark Genie's attack caused the Atla to be scattered throughout several dungeons. So now Toan has to fight his way through each of them one floor at a time in order to recover all of the Atla and rebuild the world. Now the story overall doesn't really contain many twists and turns until the very end, as most of the story is just repeated sequences in which Toan has to journey to a location, rebuild a town, beat a boss, and then repeat until he has the means to take on the Dark Genie in the final dungeon. However, besides the main conflict, I feel that the best part of Dark Cloud's story are Toan's interactions with the various townsfolk he saves and the allies he recruits throughout his journey. Each town that you rebuild has their own unique characteristics that are reflected in the individual buildings you put together and the townsfolk you rescue. The very first town, known as Naroon Village, is one of the best ways to introduce this aspect of the story, as that town contains people that already know and want to help your main character. The later towns also managed to stand out, like how Queens is characterized by the amount of carts and shops run by merchants due to the town being a fishing port, and how the residents of Madataki Village all wear furs due to its history as a hunting village. All of the townsfolk have slightly different personalities and requests for you that further characterize the settlements, such as the sheriff's request to be next to a crime lord, or a lady's request to be far away from her noisy neighbors. I also do like the personalities of the allies you end up recruiting, and I love many of their interactions with their fellow townsfolk. But I hate that their story involvement becomes restricted to gameplay as soon as you complete their town's respective dungeon. I guess it does make sense that it would happen, since those allies have zero connections with all of the other towns, but I kind of wish that they would just have 1 or 2 additional cutscenes in the later towns, so as to make them feel a part of the world more. So while I feel the main story isn't the very strongest, the individual stories told by the towns and its residents really characterized the world and made the story better for it. And this ties in with why the gameplay itself is engaging. The main objective for most of Dark Cloud is to acquire Atla and rebuild the world. Each dungeon has several floors that Toan must get through in order to obtain all of the Atla and fight the boss. Each floor usually has a good amount of enemies to fight, Atla to obtain, and treasure. But in order to progress to the next floor, you have to obtain a key item that any random enemy can have, effectively preventing the player from avoiding combat up to the boss. Treasure chests in each respective floor contain items that help you along. Small chests contain health items, cures, repair powder, upgrade items, and sometimes they will contain another type of key item, which allows you to enter a back floor. Back floors contain tougher enemies and much more valuable items, such as gemstones, which can be used to upgrade weapons much more significantly than regular upgrade items. Other than the small chests, there are also the large chests, which have different items and a different mechanic. Most large chests are locked, but they can be opened if you find a treasure chest key. But you don't have to find a key per se, because all locked treasure chests have one of 3 traps, either poison, explosion, or curse. You have the option to guess which one it is in order to open the chest and retrieve the item, but if you guess it wrong, you get hit by the trap. Which brings me to an issue. As long as you have enough health and or cure items to survive, you can risk guessing the trap, because once the trap goes off, you can guess the correct trap the second time and always get the item inside. I feel that if the treasure inside was destroyed after the fact, it would make it a much more difficult decision for the player, as I found myself opening every big treasure chest I found due to the lack of it. As for items obtainable in big treasure chests, you will mostly find new weapons that you can equip to the various characters, but you will also occasionally find Happy Clown, who offers you either a big present or a small present, which as of this review, I have no idea what items you could get for choosing either, and as of this point, I think it's mostly presented as that choice just to mess with the player. There are also some environmental features in each floor that can help and hinder the player. All dungeons have barriers that can either be opened up by a key or a character skill. While Toan is the only one who can obtain Atla, Zhao can jump over gaps, Goro can smash giant buttons with his hammer, Ruby can activate elemental locks, Ungaga can blow away dark fog, and Osmond can fly over any gap, making Zhao's ability useless. These barriers are mostly here just to make sure the player doesn't progress without the story essential ally for that dungeon. The latest barrier type always appears halfway through the dungeon, where at that point you will have enough Atla to complete the quest that nets you that ally. Besides the barriers, there are also water springs that can restore your thirst and health meter. There are also glyphs that you can occasionally find that will grant you a random bonus or detriment, such as 3 times cash increase or randomly changing the stats on your current weapon, which can really screw you over if you've been trying to upgrade that weapon. Exploration of these dungeons is pretty fun, and it should be considering the fact that the game is roguelike, which means you will be spending a lot of time in these dungeons. There are a couple of exploration mechanics that seem to be added just to reduce frustration. Escaping the dungeon is very simple. You either have to clear out all of the enemies on the floor in order to mine connect to the Fairy King, or you can just use the escape powder, which is incredibly cheap in the game's various shops. Whenever you leave a dungeon, you can immediately teleport back to the latest floor as soon as you return. Which for this game makes sense, because if you have already collected the Atla on the previous floors, then there is really no reason to replaying those floors unless you wish to grind. In addition to that, I should probably mention that whenever you die, you usually have to leave half of whatever gold you have before you respawn in the town. But instead, you can just buy stand-in powder, which allows you to just change into one of your still alive allies instead. Plus, you can revive the fallen ally by using revive powder, which you can also buy. However, one feature that I've yet to mention are the limited zones. On specific floors in every dungeon, you will run across a floor that contains a limited zone. Limited zones are floor effects that handicap you in some way. One limited zone limits you to playing as a specific character in your party for the entirety of that floor. Now I like this effect because it challenges you based on how well you have upgraded that character. But the one other type of limited zone in this game is one that kind of frustrates me, because it actively hinders your progress. This limited zone makes it so that your weapon's upgrade points decrease rather than increase. It also limits you to the weapon all your party members were carrying when you entered that floor. Since you have to kill enemies in order to get the key for the next floor, that makes it so that no matter what, you will lose progress on upgrading that weapon. And since you can't change that weapon, you can't make the tactical decision to switch out to a crappier weapon until you reach the next floor. But overall, the existence of this limited zone isn't a huge issue. But I just dislike how it slows down the progress you make upgrading your weapons, considering how important that becomes the further you get in the game. Speaking of weapons, let's talk about how combat and leveling up in this game work. None of the characters themselves level up, but their weapons do, while their other stats, defense, health, and thirst, increase through the consumption of items found in towns. The way combat in this game works is that everyone gets two attacks. A basic attack such as a combo or shooting a projectile, or a heavy attack which requires you to hold down the attack button until your character flashes, and then let go to use that attack at max damage. Using these attacks consumes the character's speed meter, which for the single strike characters Xiao, Goro, and Ruby doesn't matter, as their speed meters recharge so fast as to allow them to strike frequently. But for the other three characters, you will not be able to string together a full combo unless their speed meter is full. There is also a lock-on that allows you to track enemies, which is incredibly useful considering the normal camera's insistence that it be behind your character's back at all times. The different monsters you fight come in all shapes and sizes, such as the standard goblins, various plant monsters, golems, dragons, and much more, and all of them have slightly different attack patterns that you must consider. Some enemies like to back away from you constantly in order to shoot projectiles, some teleport after taking damage, and some block so frequently that the only way to get them vulnerable is to wait for them to attack. It's all very simple stuff, as the combat isn't really too complex. You can change a weapon's element to accommodate an enemy's weakness, or use throwables, but other than that, you can't really mix it up that much. Every enemy you kill will net you a certain amount of absorption points, or abs, which go into the weapon you are currently using. Once a weapon's abs are full, you have the option to upgrade it, and you can do this up to 10 times. But when you upgrade your weapon, it's best to have attachments equipped, as upgrading the weapons permanently fuses those attachments to the weapon. Attachments, by the way, come in two forms. They come in the basic form that upgrades single stats, the stats being attack, speed, magic endurance, elemental damage, and enemy type proficiency, and they also come in gems that can upgrade the multiple stats simultaneously to a much greater degree than the basic attachments. Depending on what weapon you have, upgrading certain stats to certain amounts will allow you to build up that weapon to an entirely new weapon with the previous weapon's stats. This is the ideal way to upgrade weapons, as it means that no matter what, your weapon will get stronger, but rather than build up the weapon, you can perform a status break when the weapon reaches +5. When you do this, you seal 60% of the weapon's stats into an attachment that can greatly boost the stats of other weapons. And using status broken weapons can be an ideal way to build up weapons faster, depending on what stats those weapons are proficient in. However, no matter how much you upgrade a weapon's durability, you must always make sure to maintain it using repair powder, because weapons can break pretty quickly and the melee weapons can break even faster. If a melee weapon is proficient at killing a certain type of monster, hitting that monster will only take off 1 point of the weapon's HP, but for every other monster, a single hit will take off 2 to 6 HP at a time, reducing that weapon's health by a ton. And if you get too careless and greedy, that weapon will break and be lost forever. That's right, if you build up a single weapon 3 times, gave it the best upgrades provided by status broken weapons, and then break that weapon, all of that hard work will go completely down the drain. That is unless you reload a save. So while the act of combat itself isn't engaging, upgrading the various weapons I owned was, as I often found myself trying to create weapons that accommodated for the enemies of whatever dungeon I was in at the time. For most of the game, I found myself with enough attachments to give to all my party members, and a ton of weapons to use them on, even if that's mostly due to the broken chest mechanic I talked about earlier. But towards the end of the game, I had 6 characters, and keeping everyone's weapons up to snuff without heavy grinding was impossible. Actually, I had trouble keeping only 5 of their weapons up to date, because I completely abandoned the idea of upgrading another character's weapons early on in order to avoid this problem. But in the last 2 dungeons of this game, and especially the last dungeon, I spent time in incredibly long grinding sessions just so most of my characters could take out normal enemies without breaking their weapons or chugging several repair powders at a time. Upgrading weapons is fun, but when you're grinding it feels like a huge tedious chore. But I had to keep grinding, or else the last 2 boss fights would have been a total pain. The best way to sum up boss fights is that they are all a test to see how well you have upgraded your weapons. These boss fights have a lot of health, and if you end up using all of your resources before the boss is down, your weapons weren't good enough. The way that boss fights are set up is that for all of the bosses except the last and arguably the second to last boss, you have to use the character you recruited in that dungeon in order to be able to damage the boss. For the most part, this involves using that ally's ability to knock down the boss to a state in which he can be hurt by any other character. For example, in the first boss fight against Dran, Toan can't hit him because he is flying around. But if you hit Dran with Zhao's slingshot, he will come down so that Toan can hit him with a power attack. Now this doesn't make much sense because of his size, but this fight does establish what you are going to need to do for many of the other boss fights. However, the prime exception to this rule is the final boss. Now I'm not going to show any footage of this boss to avoid spoilers, and I'm also going to be as vague as possible when I'm describing him. But if you don't want any semblance of a spoiler, skip to the time I'm showing you now. If you're still with us, the final boss has a couple of problems. First of all, your ability to damage him depends on which element you have equipped, which makes it so that you have to constantly go through the menus and switch it out, which can be very tedious and annoying. Secondly, he has multiple stages, each of them all have massive amounts of health, so the amount of repair powder and health items that you will need to survive will be immense. And health items wouldn't be a problem if it wasn't for my last issue, and that is the boss has a completely unavoidable attack. It's impossible to run from, and blocking will not deter the attack in any way. At the point I was at with my characters, it took that attack 2 hits to kill my character, and in addition, the boss cycles through its attacks at random, so you can be hit by this attack up to 3 times in a row. The combat options in this game are limited, but I really wish they found other ways to make the boss difficult without making it have massive amounts of health and having an invincible attack. Luckily, all of the other bosses are fine. They themselves are repetitive due to most of them requiring a 1-2 punch strategy with your allies' abilities, but they aren't frustrating, and as tests to see if you have been upgrading your weapons properly, they serve their purpose. There are definitely some problems with the game's balance that become more and more apparent as you progress through the later dungeons. There are a lot of enemies that are just a pain to deal with, such as the lava enemies, which attack very quickly and block most ranged attacks. There are also the fish enemies whose attack is way too long and annoying to the point where it makes more sense to use ranged characters. In fact, there are some enemies in the game whose movesets are so ridiculous and powerful that it only makes sense to take them out with a ranged character. And speaking of ranged characters, you first get Zhao, who shoots enemies with her slingshot, but then later you unlock Ruby, who also has ranged attacks, except Ruby can charge her ranged attack for even better damage. Zhao retains her usefulness by being able to jump over gaps, but by the time you unlock Osmond, who can just fly over gaps, Zhao becomes completely useless. But despite some of the flaws involving the game's balance in the final boss, I'd say it definitely succeeds in its roguelike aspects. With every floor I explored, I was looting chests, gathering Atla, and gaining absorption points for my character's weapons. And even if I died, I could start where I left off with a new batch of consumables I bought from shops. And all these mechanics contributed to this game's sense of constant and satisfying progression, with only the limited floors and inevitable grinding sessions hindering it. And the fact that I felt that satisfaction tells me that Dark Cloud definitely succeeds as a roguelike. But now I need to talk about what sets Dark Cloud apart from other roguelikes, and that's how it simultaneously has SimCity-esque town building mechanics. As I have already mentioned, the main goal of Dark Cloud is to go into a town's respective dungeon and retrieve all of that town's Atla in order to rebuild it. All of the Atla that you have collected can be used in Georama mode. Georama mode is a mode that allows you to assemble buildings, place said buildings alongside additional structures such as roads and trees, and view a chart which allows you to keep track of how many parts you have, how many of them are placed, and how happy the villagers are. Now, by my own definition, there are 3 types of Atla that you can acquire. First, there are buildings, which consist of all houses, shops, and every other type of inhabitable structure. You use the Configure Assembly menu in Georama mode to place buildings on the map. You can place them in pretty much any location you want as long as it fits on the map's grid-like structure, but the buildings aren't much without the second type of Atla that I like to call parts. In the same menu as before, you can add parts to fill these slots that appear next to the building. A lot of the buildings in a single village use the same parts, which is nice when you want to focus on completing certain buildings before others. But one type of part that is unique to each building are the villagers themselves. The villagers are also classified as Atla as they each belong to a specific building. It's always a priority to add villagers to their respective homes, because that way you can talk to them outside of the Georama and ask them what they need for their house, as it's not all initially revealed to you. You can also just say hello to the villagers and ask them what will happen once their house is finished, since they will give you a reward for doing so. Now, I just loved this aspect of the town building. The cutscenes themselves are incredibly rewarding to watch, as they show off the respective villagers' personalities that helped characterize the village. Even the main character shows off some personality in these cutscenes, with the amusing ways he reacts to some of the villagers' antics. Some may say that this defeats the purpose of a silent protagonist somewhat, but I feel that those interactions make me feel even more involved in the villagers' lives. It's nice to feel that the villagers appreciate my help, and it's even better if my character responds to it properly instead of being ominously silent. Another thing that happens as you assemble buildings is that chests will spawn in and around the house that will contain several types of items. You can find consumables in these chests, but the number one thing that you can get from them are the upgrade items. As I mentioned earlier, consuming items found in towns are one of the only ways to level up your characters. You can find gourds that increase your thirst meter, fruits of Eden that increase your health, or you can find one of the many character-specific items that boost defense, such as the fluffy donut for Toan or the fish candy for Zhao. Now, the last type of Atla are natural structures, which consist of hills, trees, rivers, roads, lakes, and anything that can't be assembled. These are used for additional decoration and design for the towns. But using all of these Atla together is essential in another town building mechanic in which you fulfill requests. One of the other things you can ask the villagers is if they have any specific requests. Fulfilling these requests involves you placing Atla in certain ways, such as someone's request to live close to a fishing pond, or a request to live close to or away from a particular neighbor. A lot of these requests are cool in the way that they further characterize the town and its inhabitants. In the fishing port town of Queens, the fishing merchant will request to be put close to the ocean. And in that same town, there is a crime lord named King, who is so full of himself that he wants a road to directly connect to his estate. And in addition to that, there's the sheriff of that town, whose request is to be put next to the king's estate in order to keep an eye on him. Requests like these are almost in every town, and while they may restrict the way that you want to customize the town, there are different ways that you can fulfill everyone's requests with different setups. Plus, once you have all of that town's Atla and simultaneously fulfill everyone's request, you will get a huge reward from whoever is in charge of that town for doing so. Once you have received that reward, you can place the Atla wherever you want, without having to worry about it. Though, personally, I never felt like doing that, because with all the hard work I put into gathering the Atla and putting them in the right place, undoing any of that just seems pointless. All of the towns looked nice anyway, with the Atla placement corresponding with the townspeople's requests. Just like the dungeon exploration, the town building gave me a constant feeling of satisfaction. And unlike the dungeon exploration, there was an additional satisfaction felt from the ability to customize and interact with the villagers in cutscenes. I really felt attached to the villagers, and I was always eager to return so that I could build more of the town and watch more amusing and heartwarming cutscenes. All of these mechanics that center around helping the townsfolk not only made me feel like I was really helping them out, but it also made me feel that I was really helping the world recover from what could have been a devastating apocalypse. And for that reason, Dark Cloud succeeds in making me feel immersed in its world. One thing I didn't mention as I was explaining the town mechanics is that once you unlock the fishing pond/lake Atla, you can engage in a side activity which allows you to go fishing. Fishing is incredibly simple, as you just hit a button to throw the line in and wait until a fish bites. The supposed benefit of fishing is that if you catch enough fish that give you enough points for catching them, you can then spend those points on special items. But there is a huge problem with the idea of fishing in this game. You can either find bait in dungeons or you can buy them from shopkeepers. But bait is absurd because bait buys and sells for a lot, with the prices ranging from 100 to 400 gold. Due to the fact that it's possible to fail at fishing and waste bait, makes it seem absurd that I do anything but sell all of the bait I have. Because while fishing can net you rewards, selling the bait instead can net you a lot of cash that you can use to buy consumables and new weapons rather than spending points and earning less for doing so. The fishing just seems completely pointless overall. Now one last thing I need to talk about is the game's presentation. Mainly the music. Now I hate to say that Dark Cloud doesn't really have a lot of standout tracks. The opening theme and some of the boss fight themes are good, but most of the tracks could fall under the description of sounds good but is repetitive. But all of the tracks do a great job of immersing you in the town or dungeon it plays in. For example, the track that plays in the Sunken Ship dungeon begins with the sound of something moving through the water. And the rest of it is a slow, melancholic piano tune that seems like it's trying to represent slowly moving or sinking through water, so it's definitely fitting. Another example is the track that plays in your character's hometown of Naroon Village. It's hard for me to describe exactly, but it definitely evokes the feeling of nostalgia, which is appropriate as it could be a track that represents the main character's memories of his hometown. I'm not going to go into detail for the rest of the tracks, because overall I think that they all succeed in immersing the player, despite sounding repetitive at times. In addition to that, I have to say, that the tracks being repetitive but fitting is the most that this game has in common with the Legend of Zelda series. Many of you at the start of this video may have noticed that the main character looks a whole lot like Link, at least from the front, and if any of you were wondering if the game had anything in common with Zelda based off that, then I guess it could be said that their composers have the same idea. Overall, Dark Cloud succeeds both as a roguelike and a town-building game. The game does get unbalanced towards the end as lengthy grinding sessions become necessary in order to complete it, and some of the enemy movesets are too tough for non-ranged characters to take care of. But despite all of that, dungeons are filled with opportunities to upgrade weapons, find rare items, and to increase the atlet you have so that you can make more progress building towns. While the story is sort of lacking, I feel that the town's mechanics make up for it, as towns are filled with the personality of its setting and the townsfolk who live there. I love the cutscenes that played when you assembled a house, and I love how the request system further characterizes the townsfolk. Whenever I played Dark Cloud, I always found myself eager to gather as much atla as I could, so that I could build as much of the town as possible. The way leveling up works, combined with the dungeon exploration, and how that affects how much of that dungeon's town you can build, creates this really satisfying feeling of constant progress. And with that, Dark Cloud not only succeeds as a roguelike, but also as a game. I definitely recommend this game to anyone who loves roguelikes or wants to try one out. That's all I have to say, and thank you for watching.